So, imagine this for a second. You're traveling for work, or, maybe you're finally taking that much-needed vacation.
Oh, definitely a vacation.
Right, definitely a vacation. And
Yeah.
you pull up to a hotel. It's got this massive, glowing, world-famous logo right above the sliding glass doors.
Like a brand you've seen in a dozen different countries.
Exactly. Or let's take a slightly more serious scenario. You're walking into a specialty hospital clinic, right? And it bears the name of one of the most prestigious healthcare networks in the entire country.
Yeah, you see the name and you immediately relax a bit.
You do. In both of those situations, as you walk through those doors, you feel a sense of security. You really trust that logo.
Of course you did.
So you hand over your government ID at the front desk. You slide your credit card across the counter. Maybe you fill out forms with highly sensitive medical or personal information.
Which is pretty standard.
Yeah, totally standard. And you do all of this because you assume that this massive, global, multi-billion-dollar brand is holding onto your data with an iron grip.
Right, because it's their name on the building.
Exactly. But legally speaking, that logo on the building is, it's often a complete ghost.
Yeah, it really is.
The entity that's actually holding, protecting, and taking legal responsibility for your personal information, it might not actually be the brand on the building at all.
It is such a phenomenal corporate illusion. I mean, it relies entirely on consumer assumption.
Yeah.
We assume there's this direct line of legal accountability where, in reality, there's just an incredibly murky, legally fragmented web.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. The brand you trust is often just a licensing shell when it comes to your actual data.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to our deep dive into India's new data laws, where we're going to uncover this massive corporate illusion.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're exploring the landscape of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which is commonly referred to as the DPDPA.
Right.
But we aren't just reading the statute here. We are looking at a fascinating blind spot right in the middle of it.
A very big blind spot.
Yeah. It involves massive brand franchises, educational institutions, and really just the tangled question of who actually owns your data when you're operating inside a giant corporate ecosystem.
And to do this, we have some incredible source material discussing a brand new conceptual framework.
Yes, the Super Data Fiduciary.
Exactly. It's a really interesting concept. The text we're diving into explores discussions around DPDPA compliance, specifically looking at how, franchise-based businesses and educational frameworks are trying to navigate this legal gray area.
Right, using things like the DGPSI system.
Yeah, the DGPSI. And when we talk about DGPSI, we're referring to the Data Governance and Protection Standard of India.
Okay.
It's essentially a framework designed to help organizations actually implement these incredibly complex data privacy laws in the real world.
Because the real world is messy.
Exactly. The real world is where the strict wording of the DPDPA is currently just crashing headfirst into the complex architecture of modern business.
Right. So our mission today basically is to decode what the experts are calling the fiduciary pyramid.
Which is a great term.
It really is. We're going to look at the strict existing legal definitions of who handles your data, point out the massive real-world gap where these big umbrella brands operate, and explore how introducing this super data fiduciary concept could completely revolutionize how accountability is assigned.
In hotels, hospitals, universities, everywhere, really.
Exactly. So to understand how revolutionary this new concept is, I think we have to start with the foundational rules of the current law.
We definitely do.
According to our source material, the DPDPA framework is incredibly strict.
Very strict. It's highly binary by design.
Right, because it explicitly recognizes only two types of entities when it comes to touching your personal data. You have data fiduciaries and you have data processors.
And that's it. There is no middle ground.
No middle ground at all.
And, to really grasp why this matters, we have to look at the historical precedent it replaced.
Right.
Because the source text heavily contrasts this new DPDPA with the older ITA 2000 framework.
The Information Technology Act of 2000.
Exactly. Under that older law, the terminology and the legal philosophy were entirely different. You had intermediaries and you had data consumers.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because on the surface, data consumer sounds like, I don't know, the person buying product, like me or you.
Right. It sounds like the user.
Yeah. But legally, under ITA 2000, what did that actually mean?
So a data consumer under the ITA 2000 was actually any entity that took data for its own use.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So legally, they were always considered a data fiduciary.
Sure.
They held the ultimate responsibility.
Okay, and what about the intermediary?
Well, an intermediary was an incredibly fluid concept, depending on its specific functions at any given second. An intermediary under ITA 2000 could act as either a data processor simply passing information along, or could suddenly become a data fiduciary if it started making decisions about that data.
Wow, it sounds like a legal shapeshifter.
It basically was.
I mean, if I'm trying to sue a company for a data breach under the old law, they could just argue, oh, in that specific microsecond, we were just an intermediary acting as a processor, so we aren't liable.
Which is exactly the loophole the DPDPA sought to close.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the new law strips away that fluidity entirely. It wants clear, undeniable lines drawn in the sand.
You're either this or you're that.
Exactly. You are either the fiduciary making the decisions or you are the processor following orders.
Got it. Now, the source does mention one slight structural variation, which is the concept of joint data fiduciaries.
Right, the joint situation.
Yeah, the text gets very specific about how a joint situation actually works. It says this happens when the purpose and the means of using personal data are shared between two different entities.
Yes. And this is key, it makes a very strict distinction about what can actually be shared.
Right, because the text points out that the entity that declares the purpose and actually collects the data is always the primary data fiduciary. In fact, it explicitly states that the question of sharing the purpose doesn't really arise.
No, it doesn't. Because, think about it as a crucial legal mechanism. You don't just collect data into a void.
Right, there's a reason for it.
Exactly. The act of collection is inherently tied to a specific intention. Whoever declares, I am collecting this data for X reason, and then physically takes the data, becomes the data fiduciary.
So you cannot split the fundamental intention of the collection.
No, you can't. Where you can have a joint situation is strictly in the means.
Okay.
The text uses finance as the prime example here. So if a second entity comes in and determines the financial architecture for that data ecosystem, they become a joint data fiduciary.
Because they're providing the means for the data to be utilized.
Exactly.
But wait, what if a company is just doing the digital grunt work, say a cloud storage provider?
Then they are strictly a data processor.
Nothing more.
Right. If an entity is not declaring the purpose of the data, and they aren't providing the structural means like the financial architecture, but they are simply processing or storing the data on behalf of the fiduciary, they have zero fiduciary responsibility.
Okay, to make this a bit more relatable for you listening, let's think of it like a high-end restaurant.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Right. So the primary data fiduciary is the head chef. The head chef sits down, designs the menu, and decides exactly what ingredients need to be sourced to create the meal.
And that is the purpose.
Exactly. They are taking the ingredients with a specific end goal in mind. Now, the data processor in this scenario is the line cook in the back.
Okay.
The line cook is strictly chopping vegetables exactly the way the head chef instructed.
Right. The line cook doesn't get to decide what the menu is.
No, not at all. They just execute the processing of the ingredients.
And so the head chef holds the ultimate legal and creative responsibility for the dish.
Exactly. If the food is poisoned, you blame the chef who designed the plate, not the cook who just chopped the carrots.
Makes perfect sense.
And what about the joint fiduciary in that restaurant analogy?
Well, the joint fiduciary would be like the restaurant owner or the financial backer.
Ah, okay.
Because they aren't in the kitchen chopping onions, right? And they didn't write the menu. But they provide the financial means for the kitchen to operate.
So they share in the overarching structural responsibility?
Exactly, making them a joint fiduciary alongside the head chef.
So we basically have a very neat, organized legal kitchen.
We do.
Yeah.
And, the law was designed this way to establish a completely undeniable chain of accountability.
Which is what you want.
Right. If something goes wrong, like if there's a massive data breach, the legal system wants to point a finger at one specific entity and say, you declared the purpose, you collected the data, the buck stops with you.
Yeah.
It's a deliberate attempt to prevent a corporate shell game where everyone just points at a subcontractor and says, I was just doing what the other guy told me.
Which sounds great in theory, honestly. I mean, if my bank drops my data, I want to know exactly whose neck is on the line. But here is where it gets incredibly complicated. If the current law is this strictly binary, if you are either the chef or the line cook, what happens when this framework hits a massive, decentralized corporate network?
That is the big question.
Because we have laid out the strict legal definitions. Now we have to transition into the messy real world of the franchise conundrum.
It is very messy.
Yeah, the source material highlights specific business sectors where this binary legal definition breaks down entirely, primarily hospitality and healthcare.
Right.
We're talking about major hotel brands. The text specifically names Oyo, Tribo, Airbnb, Hilton, Taj, Hyatt, and Radisson.
Some of the biggest names out there.
Exactly. And in healthcare, it points to hospital networks like Apollo, Manipal, Fortis, Kim's, and Wockhardt.
Huge networks. And the core conflict here lies deep within the business architecture of the franchise model itself.
How so?
Well, let's take Radisson as the example provided in the text.
Okay.
The overarching corporate entity of Radisson merely licenses the use of their brand name and their operational systems.
Right.
Radisson Corporate is not directly, physically involved in the collection of your personal data when you walk up to a local front desk in a different country.
Okay, the text uses the example of the Atria Hotel operating under the Radisson Blu brand.
Yes.
So the local franchisee, the Atria Hotel Management, is the actual entity taking your ID, swiping your credit card, and logging your details.
Exactly.
Legally, under the strict definitions we just discussed, Atria is the primary data fiduciary. They're collecting the data for the purpose of booking your room.
That's right.
But wait, okay, let's unpack this. If I'm the consumer, I don't care about Atria. I don't even know who Atria is.
Yep.
I trust the Radisson brand.
And this creates a massive mismatch between legal liability and reputational trust.
Completely.
I mean, if you go to stay at the Atria Hotel operating under the Radisson Blu brand, and there's a massive data breach where your credit card and passport details are stolen, who are you going to blame?
Radisson. I'm going straight on social media and saying, Radisson Blu just leaked my credit card.
Right.
In the mind of the consumer, the fiduciary is the brand. I didn't trust Atria. I trusted Radisson.
Right.
So if I decide tomorrow to raise a legal claim against Radisson because of the negligence of the local hotel, what actually happens? I imagine Radisson's lawyers would immediately say, hey, look at the strict binary definitions of the DPDPA.
They absolutely would.
You're just a branding and licensing company. We didn't collect your data. Atria collected your data. They are the data fiduciary. Go sue Atria.
And under a strict literal reading of the current DPDPA, Radisson's lawyers might be completely right.
Wow.
Because the law isolates who physically pressed the button to collect the data.
But that feels so wrong.
It does. And the source text acknowledges these are, quote, difficult questions to answer because it ignores how a franchise actually functions under the hood.
Right.
The umbrella brand isn't just hands-off. To protect the reputation of the larger brand, franchisors impose incredibly strict policies, operating procedures, and specific data sharing mandates on their affiliates.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that, because that is where the legal argument gets fascinating. How exactly does a brand like Radisson exert control over data they claim they don't legally collect?
It happens through mandated technological infrastructure.
Oh, like the software they use.
Exactly. When you swipe your credit card at the Atria Hotel, that local front desk isn't just saving your data on some dusty hard drive in the back room.
I would hope not.
Right. Radisson Corporate dictates exactly what property management software Atria must use. They dictate the exact APIs, the application programming interfaces that must be active so that your local booking data is instantly beamed back to Radisson's centralized cloud servers in another country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Radisson uses that data for their global loyalty programs, their revenue tracking, and their marketing algorithms.
So they are forcing the franchise to use specific software that funnels the data up to the mothership.
Yes.
But when the data gets breached, they point to the DPDPA and say, well, the franchisee took the data first, so they are the fiduciary.
It's an incredible magic trick.
It really is. They get all the benefit of your trust, all the financial upside of the data analytics and franchise fees. But when the legal heat comes down, they claim they're just an innocent bystander.
Exactly. And the binary system of fiduciary and processor simply lacks the legal vocabulary to describe a, brand licensor who dictates the exact technological means of data processing, vacuums up the data via APIs, but doesn't technically interact with the consumer to collect it.
Yeah, there's no word for that in the law right now.
Right. And this isn't just a hypothetical problem. It is the reality for millions of transactions every single day.
But wait, why wouldn't the overarching brand just be considered a joint data fiduciary under the law? We talked about how providing the financial means makes you a joint fiduciary. Doesn't providing the software and the branding count as providing the means?
You'd think so, but it is a fiercely debated legal gray area.
Oh, really?
Yeah. A brand's lawyers will argue that providing a software template is not the same as determining the means of a specific transaction. They'll argue they are merely providing a service to the franchisee, much like a software vendor.
Okay, so just passing the buck again?
Pretty much. So to definitively close this loophole, the experts analyzing the DGPSI system realized they couldn't just stretch the old definitions. They had to mint an entirely new jurisprudential concept.
Which brings us to the design of the Super Data Fiduciary.
Yes, finally.
Because the current laws fail so spectacularly to capture how these massive franchise models operate, this new framework aims to bridge the gap.
It does.
Let's read the exact definition of this proposed concept from the source because every word feels very deliberate.
It is very deliberate.
Okay. It defines a super data fiduciary as an entity which, though not necessarily the primary collector or operational processor of personal data, exercises overarching reputational, governance, policy, economic, or ecosystem control over subordinate data fiduciaries operating under a common brand, institutional framework, or delegated authority.
It is a brilliantly constructed definition.
Why is that?
Because it immediately sidesteps the trap of focusing on who physically takes the data. By stating that this entity does not necessarily have to be the primary collector, it renders that whole "we didn't swipe the card" defense entirely moot.
Oh, I see.
It focuses the legal lens entirely on power and control.
It creates what the text calls the fiduciary pyramid.
Exactly. Rather than a flat legal structure, we need to visualize a hierarchy.
Okay.
At the absolute top apex sits the super data fiduciary. They're placed there based on their overarching control and public perception.
Right.
Beneath them, in the middle tier, is the operational data fiduciary. This is the entity that actually interacts with the consumer and collects the personal data.
So that would be the local hotel, like Atria.
Yes. And at the very base of the pyramid, you have your joint data fiduciaries and your data processors, the financial gateways, the third-party IT vendors managing the local servers, things like that.
Wow, it perfectly captures the puppet master dynamic of modern corporations.
It really does.
Think about it. I'd love for you listening to consider how many services you use daily, where you're actually interacting with the subordinate operational fiduciary, but you're trusting the super fiduciary at the top.
It's probably most of them, honestly.
Yeah. But if I'm the CEO of Hilton or Apollo Hospitals, I am lobbying against this framework immediately.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, why would a massive brand ever accept a legal framework that creates a massive liability for them where none existed before?
Well, they wouldn't accept it willingly.
Right.
This concept is being proposed precisely because brands have historically used the ambiguity of the law to shield themselves.
Makes sense.
The DGPSI framework is an attempt by regulators and standards bodies to force legal accountability to match consumer reality.
Okay, so let's break that down.
If you look at the specific mechanics of control mentioned in the definition, it leaves these giant brands with literally nowhere to hide. The definition lists 5 specific types of control: reputational, governance, policy, economic, and ecosystem.
Let's go through those because they really map onto how these businesses actually run under the hood.
Okay, let's do it.
Reputational control is obvious. The big brand dictates the logo, the marketing, and the implicit promise of security to the consumer.
Exactly. But governance and policy control go much deeper.
How so?
The overarching brand doesn't just, suggest how to run the hotel. They enforce it with audit rights.
Yeah.
They dictate what cybersecurity standards the local franchisee must maintain, how often they must change passwords, and how long they're allowed to keep customer records.
So they're micromanaging the data anyway.
Yes.
Okay.
If the super fiduciary is dictating the security policy, they share the blame when that policy fails.
Right. What about economic control?
Economic control involves the centralized financial architecture. Franchisors often force franchisees to use specific centralized payment gateways so the franchisor can seamlessly skim their revenue share off the top of every transaction.
Wow.
Right? By controlling the flow of money, they inherently control the operational limits of the subordinate.
That makes total sense. And the last one is ecosystem control. That sounds almost biological.
A biological analogy is actually the best way to understand it.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of the super data fiduciary as the central nervous system and the operational fiduciaries, the local hotels or clinics, as the nerve endings.
Okay.
The nerve ending physically touches the hot stove, right? It collects the raw data input. But the nerve ending doesn't decide what to do with that information. it instantly transmits it back into the closed-loop environment of the central nervous system.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to picture it.
Yeah, a massive tech ecosystem or a hospitality rewards program operates the exact same way. The subordinate franchisee is forced to operate entirely within the digital walls built by the overarching brand.
Because that's the nervous system.
Exactly. If you control the central nervous system, you cannot wash your hands of liability just because the nerve ending is the part that touched the consumer.
I love that analogy. It completely flips the script on how we view corporate responsibility.
It does.
But, as fascinating as the commercial, hotel, and hospital examples are, the text pivots to an entirely different sector.
Yeah, it does a pretty hard pivot.
While commercial franchises perfectly illustrate the commercial need for this concept, the source material argues that there is an entirely different sector where this fiduciary pyramid is even more structurally embedded and perhaps even more sensitive.
And that is higher education.
Yes, higher education.
When you look at how a massive university system is structured, it is basically the ultimate permanent manifestation of that fiduciary pyramid we just built.
Really?
Yeah, the source specifically applies the Super Data Fiduciary Concept to the educational sector using the DGPSI system framework.
Let's trace the structure because it's wild. At the top of the pyramid, you have the university.
Right.
Below the university, you have the individual colleges.
Okay.
But it goes even deeper than that. Inside those colleges, you have highly autonomous departments. The text lists departments for teaching, examination, research, library maintenance, and sports maintenance.
It really is a pyramid made of smaller pyramids.
It is.
And if we trace the flow of your personal data through this massive structure, it reveals a profound disconnect.
How so?
According to the text, personal data almost always originates at the college level, specifically during admissions.
Okay, wait, the text does mention one exception to this, right? The CET system.
Yes, it does.
Huh.
For those unfamiliar, CET stands for Common Entrance Test.
Okay.
In some regions, a centralized external government authority actually handles the massive initial data collection for standardized testing, and then they allocate the admissions to a specific college.
Ah, so that's the exception.
Right. But putting that centralized exception aside, generally the student walks into the local college or interacts with the local college web portal to apply.
So the local college is the entity physically taking your intake forms, your high school transcripts, your home address, and your medical history for the sports team.
Exactly. Therefore, under strict DPDPA definitions, the colleges act as what the text calls data generators.
Got it.
They are the first operational data fiduciaries for the specified purpose of enrolling you. They consume the raw information you provide, and they record it to create your student records.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Think about the profound irony of this system. As a student, you spend 4, maybe 6 years handing over incredibly intimate personal data to a dozen different, largely autonomous departments within a specific local college.
Oh, yeah.
The library tracks what you read and research. The sports department tracks your physical health, your injuries, your biometrics. The teaching department tracks your daily attendance, your psychological evaluations, your performance.
It's a massive amount of data.
It is. You're generating a massive, highly sensitive data profile. But at the end of those 4 years, what happens? Your ultimate degree, the entire public-facing, permanent result of your education carries only the name of the overarching university.
Wow. And that university sitting at the top of the pyramid may have barely touched your raw day-to-day data. Yet, as the text explicitly states, the colleges conduct the examinations, they provide the daily education, but the examination authority declares the final results completely under the overarching banner of the university.
The university gets all the credit, all the prestige, and provides the ultimate reputational control, exactly like Radisson or Hilton.
Conceptually, it is an identical dynamic.
Yeah.
But the stakes are arguably much higher because educational and medical data are permanent.
Absolutely.
Every delegated department within the college is a working operational data fiduciary. But the university, because everything is executed in its name and under its institutional framework, acts as the ultimate super data fiduciary.
Okay, let's run a hypothetical scenario to see why this really matters.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say a local college's sports department is using an outdated, unpatched server to store student-athlete medical records.
Sounds plausible.
Very plausible. And they suffer a massive cyber attack, and a decade of student medical histories is leaked onto the dark web.
Nightmare scenario.
Total nightmare. As a student, you trust the name of the major university on your diploma. Does the overarching university get to just shrug and say, hey, we are just the brand name on the degree, go sue the local college sports department?
Under the strict old definitions, they would absolutely try to.
Of course they would.
They'd argue that the sports department declared the purpose and collected the data, making them the sole fiduciary.
Right.
That is exactly why applying the Super Data Fiduciary Concept to the DGPSI-Education framework is so vital.
Because it forces them to take responsibility.
Exactly. It forces the university to take overarching legal responsibility for the cybersecurity practices of every autonomous department operating under its banner.
Which is how it should be.
If the university wants the prestige of putting its name on the degree, it has to enforce a unified, secure data ecosystem across all its subordinate colleges.
Okay, so we have built this incredible conceptual pyramid.
We have.
We've shown how it applies to giant commercial franchises, and we've shown how it perfectly describes the massive decentralized structures of higher education.
Right.
But conceptual frameworks are great until they have to survive a brutal cross-examination in an actual courtroom.
Very true.
What happens when we try to legally enforce this new accountability on these educational superfiduciaries?
We hit massive, pre-existing legal roadblocks.
Unsurprising.
The text refers to these as points to ponder, and they represent significant blind spots in constitutional law.
Point 1 from the text is pretty foundational, right? The actual liabilities of a super data fiduciary under the current DPDPA are completely undefined.
Completely undefined, because the concept literally does not exist in the bare text of the law yet.
Wow.
The DPDPA only knows fiduciaries and processors. Therefore, as the source notes, frameworks like the DGPSI system must formally define these responsibilities completely from scratch.
They are writing the rule book as they fly the plane.
They really are. They're trying to establish what a brand's duty of care actually is, with no prior roadmap.
But the second point is where things get truly complicated, especially for universities. It's what the text calls the instrumentality of state loophole.
Oh, this is a major constitutional friction point.
Walk us through it.
Well, the text points out that a university often falls under the direct governance or funding of a state government.
Right, public universities.
Because of this direct governmental link, the university could claim the legal status of an instrumentality of state.
So what does this all mean for you listening? What does being an instrumentality of state actually get you in a court of law?
It grants you sweeping legal exemptions.
Oh, of course.
Governments generally write laws that give themselves massive carve-outs for liability, national security, or administrative efficiency.
Naturally.
If the university at the top of the pyramid is granted the privileged exemptions of being an instrumentality of state, it fundamentally alters their liability under data protection laws.
So they might be shielded from massive fines or class action lawsuits that a private company would face.
Exactly.
The text raises a massive moot question regarding this, right?
Yes, it does.
Should this highly privileged, exempt status trickle down to the subordinate colleges operating under the university?
It's a huge question.
Yeah. If the overarching university is shielded by state immunity, does that umbrella of immunity cover the local sports department that just leaked my medical records?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an important question about the limits of sovereign immunity in the digital age.
Yeah, it does.
If that exemption trickles down, millions of students could find themselves with essentially zero legal recourse if their data is mishandled by a local college department.
That's terrifying.
It would essentially nullify the entire purpose of data protection laws for anyone interacting with a state-affiliated institution.
And it gets even more legally tangled.
Oh, it always does.
The third point the text raises involves the Supreme Court. It notes that the current Supreme Court interpretations of what constitutes an instrumentality of state have mostly been decided in the context of employment status.
Right. And to understand why this is a problem, we have to look at constitutional history.
Okay.
Decades of case law defining instrumentality of state were built around physical employment and administrative jurisdiction.
Like labor disputes and stuff.
Exactly. Courts were deciding things like whether a university janitor is technically a government employee, whether a professor is entitled to a state pension, or how labor disputes are handled.
Right.
The legal tests designed by the Supreme Court to answer those questions were entirely focused on financial control and administrative hierarchy.
Okay, so the text asks a crucial question here. Can these existing legal interpretations, built entirely for employment law, be blindly copy-pasted into the highly technical, rapidly evolving environment of data processing?
And the short answer is no. It is a profound category error.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We're trying to use a legal test designed in the 20th century for pension payouts to determine 21st century digital sovereignty and cybersecurity liability.
It's just a complete mismatch.
It is. Assuming that a university is an instrumentality of state for the purposes of employment does not automatically mean they should be granted state-level immunity when their third-party cloud provider suffers a data breach.
Right.
The courts are going to have to urgently address this friction between old constitutional precedents and modern digital realities.
It feels like trying to use the rules of baseball to referee a chess match.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Which leaves frameworks like DGPSI in a really tough spot. They have to define the responsibilities of this super fiduciary, force big brands to take accountability, while simultaneously dodging the legal landmines of state exemptions and outdated Supreme Court definitions.
We are watching the real-time evolution of jurisprudence trying desperately to catch up to the reality of how our data is actually handled.
It's wild. The law is scrambling to map a binary 20th century understanding of responsibility onto a decentralized, algorithmic, API-driven world.
That's exactly what's happening.
We have been on quite a journey today in this deep dive.
We really have covered a lot of ground.
We started down on the ground floor, looking at the strict, unyielding binary definitions of the DPDPA, where you're either a data fiduciary declaring the purpose or a data processor executing the commands.
Right, the chef and the line cook.
Exactly. We then ventured out into the messy, real world of giant corporate franchises. We looked at how massive hotel and hospital networks operate in a legal gray area, using complex software APIs and franchise agreements to reap the benefits of your trust, while outsourcing the legal liability to local operators.
Which necessitated the creation of this novel concept, the Super Data Fiduciary.
The pyramid.
Yes, an entity defined not by who physically touches the keyboard, but by who wields the reputational, policy, and ecosystem control over the entire network.
We built that fiduciary pyramid, and then we applied it to the vast systems of higher education.
Which was eye-opening.
Truly, realizing that universities are the ultimate example of a super fiduciary taking the credit while local autonomous departments actually handle the sensitive data.
Yeah.
And finally, we crashed headfirst into the legal blind spots, the dangerous loopholes of state exemptions, and the struggle to apply old employment law to modern digital data.
A lot to think about.
So for you listening, here is the big takeaway. The next time you check into a massive name brand hotel or, the next time you enroll in a sprawling university program, I want you to stop and think deeply about that fiduciary pyramid.
Look at the logo on the door.
Exactly. Look at the logo on the door or the crest on the letter and ask yourself, who is actually taking your data right now and who is merely lending a trustworthy name to the transaction?
Because once you see the corporate ecosystem through the lens of ecosystem control, it changes how you view every digital interaction you have with a large institution.
It really does. And we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We've talked extensively about how creating this legal framework of the Super Data Fiduciary is designed to finally hold these giant umbrella brands accountable for the policies they enforce.
Right.
But here is the provocative question. If a massive brand knows that their main asset is their reputation, does creating a strict legal framework that holds them accountable for the actions of their franchisees actually incentivize them to build better, more secure systems? Or will it just encourage these billion-dollar corporations to hire armies of lawyers to write even more ironclad, complex contracts that completely sever them legally and technologically from their affiliates?
That's the fear.
Yeah. If they choose to legally isolate themselves rather than improve security, could this attempt to protect the consumer actually backfire?
Leaving you with even less protection.
Exactly. Leaving you with even less protection and an even more convoluted maze to navigate when a local data breach inevitably occurs. Think about it.